The radar screen lit up like a Christmas tree from hell. 400 blips, maybe more, racing toward us at 200 miles per hour. My Grumman F6F Hellcat shuddered beneath me as I banked hard starboard, following Lieutenant Commander McCampbell's lead fighter into what would become the most lopsided aerial massacre in naval history. It was June 19, 1944, and the Japanese mobile fleet had just launched every flyable aircraft they had at Task Force 58. They called it Operation Ego. We called it Target Practice. Tally-ho. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. McCampbell's voice crackled through my headset as I pushed the throttle forward, feeling 1,800 horsepower of Pratt and Whitney radial engine surge beneath my boots. Below us, the Philippine Sea stretched endlessly blue, dotted with the gray silhouettes of Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet. Above us, the sky was about to become a graveyard. My name is Lieutenant Junior Great Tommy Patterson, and I was 23 years old when I witnessed Japan's aerial power die in a single afternoon. What happened that day over the Marianas would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the day American naval aviation proved its absolute dominance over the once mighty Japanese carrier force. By sunset, we would shoot down nearly 400 enemy aircraft while losing only 29 of our own. It was butchery disguised as aerial combat, and I had a front row seat. But let me start from the beginning, because the turkey shoot didn't happen by accident. It was the product of months of planning, years of training, and the hard-won lessons of 3 years of Pacific warfare. 3 weeks earlier, we'd received word that Admiral Raymond Spruance was taking the Fifth Fleet west to support the invasion of Saipan. The island sat like a dagger pointed at Japan's heart, only 1,300 miles from Tokyo. If we took Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, we'd have air bases within B-29 range of the Japanese home islands. The enemy knew it, too. Intelligence reports suggested they were massing their entire mobile fleet under Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa for one last decisive battle. I remember standing on the flight deck of USS Lexington, the new one, not the original Lady Lex we'd lost at Coral Sea, watching our task force steam west through waters that had swallowed so many good ships and better men. The morning sun painted the flight deck gold as plane captains ran through pre-flight checks on row after row of Hellcats, Corsairs, Dauntlesses, and Avengers. 15 fast carriers in 4 task groups, carrying over 900 aircraft. It was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. "Hey, Patterson." Ensign Billy Morrison called out from his Hellcat 2 planes down. He was 19, fresh from flight school in Pensacola, with exactly 47 hours of combat time. "Think we'll see some action out there?" I was tightening the shoulder straps on my parachute harness, checking my Mae West for the 3rd time that morning. After 2 years in the Pacific, I'd learned to be superstitious about survival gear. "Kid," I said, "where we're going, the Japs will throw everything they've got at us. Question is whether we'll have any targets left after the first wave." Billy laughed, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. Hell, we were all nervous. The scuttlebutt said Ozawa was coming with 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft. It would be the biggest carrier battle since Midway, and this time we were going into their backyard. What Billy didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that the Japanese were walking into a trap 2 years in the making. The Japan that faced us in June 1944 was not the same nation that had struck Pearl Harbor. Their carrier force looked impressive on paper, 9 flat tops including the massive 73,000-ton Teiho and the veteran Shokaku, but appearances were deceiving. The cream of their naval aviators, the men who had terrorized the Pacific from Hawaii to Australia, were dead. Shot down over the Coral Sea, burned alive at Midway, lost in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign. The pilots now manning their aircraft had an average of perhaps 60 hours of flight time. Many had never landed on a carrier before their first combat mission. They were flying the same aircraft that had dominated the early war, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, while we had moved on to newer, deadlier machines. The F6F Hellcat I strapped into every morning was built specifically to kill Zeros. It was faster, more heavily armed, and could take punishment that would shred a Japanese fighter. More importantly, it was flown by pilots who had survived the crucible of 2 years of combat. The average experience level in my squadron was over 200 combat hours. We had learned to fight as teams, to use our aircraft strengths, and to exploit Japanese weaknesses. But that morning of June 19th, as we launched for dawn patrol, none of us expected what was coming. I was flying combat air patrol at 24,000 feet when the first radar contacts appeared. It was 10:15 a.m., and I was starting to wonder if the Japanese would show up at all. Then Lieutenant Commander McCampbell's voice cut through the radio static. "All fabled stations, this is fabled leader. We have multiple bogies inbound from the west, range 150 miles. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." My heart hammered against my ribs as I banked left to follow McCampbell's lead division. Below us, the task force began its deadly dance, destroyers laying smoke, cruisers turning to unmask their anti-aircraft batteries, carriers launching every available fighter. Within minutes, over 200 Hellcats and Corsairs were climbing to intercept. Through my headphones, I could hear the controlled chaos of aerial warfare beginning. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high. I've got 3 Zeeks diving on the tin cans. Break left, splash 1. But we were still 40 miles out from the main enemy formation when I got my first glimpse of what we were up against. A wall of aircraft stretched across the western horizon, Zeros, Judys, Jills, and Vals in formations that seemed to go on forever. It was magnificent and terrifying, like watching a medieval army charge across an open field," whispered Ensign Morrison over the radio. "There must be 200 of them." "Try 400, kid," I replied, pushing my throttle to the firewall. "And they're all ours." McCampbell's voice came back calm and professional. "All right, ladies, let's go to work. Remember your training, stay with your wingman, and watch for the sun." Tally-ho! What happened next defied every expectation of aerial combat. In previous battles, Japanese pilots had been skilled, aggressive, and dangerous. They had pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage, often breaking through our fighter screens to savage our ships. But this was different. This was like watching amateur hour at the local flying club. The first group of enemy fighters I encountered, a dozen Zeros in a loose formation, made every mistake in the book. They approached in a straight line, perfect targets silhouetted against the morning sun. Their leader, probably some poor kid with 50 hours of flight time, tried to turn fight with my division instead of using the Zero's superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage. I lined up my first shot at 800 yards, well beyond the effective range of the Zero's 7mm machine guns. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber Brownings were accurate and deadly at that distance. I squeezed the trigger and watched my tracers walk across the Zero's starboard wing. The Japanese fighter shuddered, belched black smoke, and began a slow spiral toward the sea. "Splash 1, I called out, already turning toward another target. The massacre had begun. All around me, Hellcats and Corsairs were tearing through Japanese formations like wolves among sheep. The enemy pilots seemed confused, unable to coordinate their attacks or respond to our tactics. They flew straight lines when they should have weaved, climbed when they should have dived, and broke formation at the first sign of resistance. My wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Eddie Kowalski, got 2 Vals in a single pass, his .50 calibers ripping through the dive bombers' unarmored fuselages like tissue paper. "They're not even trying to evade," he shouted over the radio. "It's like shooting clay pigeons," but it wasn't just their poor flying that doomed the Japanese. Their aircraft, once feared throughout the Pacific, were now obsolete. The Zero that had terrorized Allied pilots in 1942 was revealed as a death trap in 1944, lightly built, poorly armored, with fuel tanks that exploded at the first hit. Against the rugged, heavily armed Hellcats, they stood no chance. I watched one Zero take a single, 50 caliber round in the wing root and simply disintegrate in a ball of orange flame. Another tried to ram my division leader, but came apart under the concentrated fire of 4 Hellcats before it got within 500 yards. Within 30 minutes of first contact, the sky was filled with burning Japanese aircraft. Parachutes dotted the blue expanse like white flowers, though many enemy pilots went down with their planes, either killed in the cockpit or choosing death over the dishonor of capture. Not all the killing was one-sided, of course. The Japanese still had courage, even if they lacked skill and equipment. I watched 3 Zeros gang up on Ensign Morrison's Hellcat, their combined fire tearing through his engine cowling and sending him into a spiraling dive. His voice came over the radio, high and scared. "I'm hit. I'm hit. Oil pressure's dropping and my engine's seizing up." "Stay with it, Billy," I called back, diving to cover his escape. "You can make it back to the fleet." But the kid's engine gave out 20 miles short of the task force. I watched his propeller windmill to a stop, watched him trim the big fighter for a dead-stick landing in the Philippine Sea. His Hellcat hit the water at 90 knots and cartwheeled twice before coming to rest upside down. Billy Morrison never got out. He was 19 years old, and he died fighting over an ocean 8,000 miles from his home in Nebraska. The Japanese lost 24 aircraft in that first wave alone, but Billy's death reminded me that even a turkey shoot could claim good men. By noon, we thought it was over. The first Japanese attack had been shattered, its survivors limping back toward their carriers. Our combat air patrol began cycling back to the carriers for fuel and ammunition, confident that we had broken the enemy's main effort. We were wrong. At 12:30 p.m., radar picked up another massive formation approaching from the northwest. This one was even larger than the first, over 100 aircraft, including 30 of their new Judy dive bombers. These were supposedly Japan's best remaining pilots, held in reserve for the decisive moment. I was just touching down on Lexington's flight deck when the alarm sounded. "All pilots man your aircraft. Multiple bogies inbound. Launch immediately." The deck crew swarmed over my Hellcat like ants, refueling and rearming in record time. Within 15 minutes, I was airborne again, climbing to join the reformed combat air patrol. This time, we intercepted the enemy formation 60 miles out, well beyond their effective attack range. The second engagement was, if anything, more lopsided than the first. The Japanese pilots showed slightly better formation discipline, but they were still flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training. The Judy dive bombers, supposedly their most advanced aircraft, proved vulnerable to head-on attacks, their pilots unable to cope with the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower. I got 3 in that engagement, 2 Judys and a Zero that tried to bounce me from above. The Judys went down hard, their crews trapped in the cockpits as their aircraft burned. The Zero pilot managed to bail out, and I watched his parachute drift toward the empty sea. He would die of exposure long before any rescue ship could reach him, but at least he had a chance. By 1:30 p.m., the second wave was finished. Japanese aircraft littered the ocean surface for 50 miles in every direction. Some were still burning, sending black smoke plumes into the tropical sky. Others had already slipped beneath the waves, taking their crews to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese weren't done yet. At 2 p.m., radar detected a third formation, smaller than the first 2, but including some of their newest aircraft. These were the remnants of the mobile fleet's air groups, scraped together from every operational carrier in Admiral Ozawa's force. By now, our own fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition. Several pilots had landed with empty guns, their aircraft switched cheesed by enemy fire. But Task Force 58 had depth. Fresh squadrons were launching from every available carrier, eager to get into the fight before it ended. I was flying with my fuel gauge showing half empty when we made contact with the third wave. These Japanese pilots were better than their predecessors. They maintained information discipline and attempted coordinated attacks on our shipping. But they were still flying Zeros and Vals against Hellcats and Corsairs flown by experienced combat veterans. The engagement lasted only 20 minutes. I watched Lieutenant Commander McCampbell shoot down his fifth aircraft of the day, a personal record that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Our squadron alone claimed 18 kills without a single loss. But it was Lieutenant Roy Rushing who provided the most memorable moment of the day. Flying a Corsair from USS Bunker Hill, Rushing found himself alone against 8 Japanese fighters. Instead of fronting, he turned into them, using his aircraft's superior diving speed to break up their formation. In the melee that followed, he shot down 4 enemy fighters and damaged 2 more before other Hellcats arrived to help. "How the hell did you do that, Roy?" someone asked over the radio. Rushing's reply became legendary in the squadron. "Hell, I just kept shooting until they stopped coming at me." By 4 p.m., it was over. The sky, which had been filled with aircraft all morning, was suddenly empty except for our own returning fighters. The Japanese mobile fleet had thrown everything it had at Task Force 58 and achieved exactly nothing. Not a single American ship had been sunk, and only minor damage had been inflicted on a few vessels. The cost to the Japanese was catastrophic. They had lost over 400 aircraft, virtually their entire carrier-based air force. More importantly, they had lost most of their remaining experienced aircrew. Pilots who had taken years to train were dead in the space of 6 hours, their knowledge and experience gone forever. American losses were minimal, 29 aircraft and 27 aircrew. It was the most lopsided victory in naval aviation history, a triumph that effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations. I landed on Lexington's deck at 4:45 p.m. with my fuel gauge reading empty and 4 victory flags painted on my aircraft's cowling. The deck crew cheered as I climbed out of the cockpit, but I felt no elation. The turkey shoot had been a victory, but it had also been a slaughter. Hundreds of young men, most of them barely out of their teens, had died that day. They had died bravely, pressing home hopeless attacks against overwhelming odds, but they had died nonetheless. What we didn't know at the time was that Admiral Ozawa had planned the battle as a trap of his own. He had intended to use his land-based aircraft from Guam and Saipan to supplement his carrier planes, creating a deadly pincer that would crush Task Force 58 between converging air attacks. The plan might have worked, except that Admiral Spruance had already neutralized the land-based threat. For weeks before the battle, American carrier raids had pounded Japanese airfields throughout the Marianas. The few aircraft that survived were quickly overwhelmed by our combat air patrols. Moreover, Ozawa had made a crucial error in judgment. He believed that Japanese pilot training and aircraft quality were still superior to American equivalents. It was a fatal miscalculation based on outdated intelligence and wishful thinking. The Japanese had not adapted to the realities of industrial warfare, where quantity and technology eventually triumph over individual skill and courage. The mobile fleet that limped away from the Philippine Sea on June 20th was a shadow of the force that had once terrorized the Pacific. 3 carriers had been sunk by American submarines, including the flagship Tahoe and the veteran Shokaku. The remaining ships carried empty flight decks, their hangars echoing with the ghosts of air groups that would never return. That evening, as Lexington steamed eastward under a carpet of tropical stars, I sat on the flight deck with the other pilots of VF-16, trying to process what we had witnessed. The turkey shoot had been a victory beyond our wildest expectations, but it had also marked the end of an era. The Japanese pilots we had fought that day were not the skilled veterans who had dominated the early Pacific War. They were boys, really, teenagers with a few months' training, flying obsolete aircraft into hopeless battles. They had shown courage, but courage alone was no longer enough. "You know what bothers me?" said Lieutenant Kowalski, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. They kept coming even when it was hopeless. Those last few Zeros that tried to ram us, they had to know they were going to die. I understood what he meant. There had been something almost tragic about the day's fighting, watching brave men throw their lives away in futile gestures. The Japanese concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded that they fight to the death rather than accept defeat. But what was honorable at the individual level became senseless slaughter when applied to an entire air force. That's the difference between us and them, I replied. We fight to win. They fight to die. And you can't build an air force on dead heroes. The truth was that American industrial might and training methods had finally overwhelmed Japanese martial spirit. Our pilots were better trained, better equipped, and better supported than their opponents. We had radar-controlled fighter direction, superior aircraft, and an endless supply of replacement pilots and planes. The Japanese had courage, but in modern warfare, courage without competence was just another form of suicide. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than just a tactical victory. It was a strategic catastrophe for Japan. With their carrier-based air power eliminated, the Japanese Navy became essentially irrelevant for the remainder of the war. The massive fleet that Admiral Yamamoto had built to challenge American dominance in the Pacific was reduced to impotence in a single afternoon. More importantly, the victory at the Philippine Sea opened the door to the American advance on the Japanese home islands. With Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in American hands, B-29 superfortresses would soon be bombing Japanese cities from bases only 1,300 miles from Tokyo. The war was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. For those of us who had fought in the Turkey Shoot, the victory came with a sobering recognition of what modern warfare had become. The romantic notion of aerial combat, individual knights jousting in the sky, had given way to industrial slaughter conducted with machine-like efficiency. We were no longer warriors. We were technicians of death, operating systems designed to kill as many enemy pilots as possible in the shortest time. In the weeks following the battle, intelligence reports revealed the full extent of Japanese losses. They had lost not just aircraft and pilots, but their entire institutional knowledge of carrier operations. The veteran flight instructors, squadron leaders, and air group commanders who had taken decades to develop were gone. Japan would never again be able to mount effective carrier-based air operations. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates put Japanese aircrew losses at over 600 killed or missing. These were not just numbers, they represented the cream of what remained of Japanese naval aviation. Young men who had been trained at enormous expense, who represented years of investment in pilot development, were dead. On our side, the losses were much lighter, but no less personal. Billy Morrison's death haunted me for months afterward. He had been so young, so eager to prove himself. His last letter home, which I helped censor, had been full of optimism about the war and plans for his return to Nebraska. His parents would receive a telegram informing them that their son had died heroically in service to his country. But I knew the truth was more complex. Billy had died because he was 19 years old and in the wrong place when 400 Japanese aircraft decided to commit suicide. By late 1944, it was clear that the Turkey Shoot had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation. The remaining carriers were reduced to serving as decoys, empty hulks with no aircraft to operate from their decks. The few surviving pilots were assigned to land-based units, where they faced the impossible task of defending Japan against ever-increasing numbers of American bombers. The psychological impact may have been even greater than the material losses. Japanese military leaders had based their entire strategy on the assumption that their superior training and fighting spirit would eventually overcome American material advantages. The Turkey Shoot proved that assumption false in the most dramatic way possible. For American pilots, the victory was deeply satisfying but also somewhat hollow. There had been little sport in the day's fighting. It had been more like pest control than aerial combat. The Japanese had fought bravely, but they had been so outclassed that the battle felt more like an execution than a fair fight. Today, more than 80 years later, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot remains the most lopsided aerial victory in naval history. It demonstrated the decisive importance of pilot training, technological superiority, and industrial capacity in modern warfare. The Japanese had learned too late that courage and tradition were poor substitutes for competence and equipment. The battle also marked the emergence of American naval aviation as the dominant force in the Pacific. The pilots who fought that day, McCampbell, Rushing, and hundreds of others, had proven that American airpower could achieve decisive results when properly employed. The lessons learned over the Philippine Sea would influence naval aviation doctrine for decades to come. For the families of the men who died that day, both American and Japanese, the Turkey Shoot was a personal tragedy wrapped in strategic triumph. Wars are won by breaking things and killing people, and June 19, 1944, was a day when both sides paid the price for their nation's ambitions. As I write this account more than 60 years after the event, I am struck by how clearly I can still remember the details of that day. The sound of my Hellcat's engine, the smell of cordite and aviation fuel, the sight of aircraft burning against the blue Pacific sky. These memories remain as vivid as if the Turkey Shoot had happened yesterday. What stays with me most, however, is not the tactical details or the strategic implications, but the human faces. Billy Morrison's boyish grin as he prepared for his first major battle. The Japanese pilot I watched bail out of his burning Zero, knowing he would probably die alone in the vast Pacific. The deck crews who worked through the night to keep our aircraft flying, understanding that their efforts meant the difference between victory and defeat. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was many things: a tactical masterpiece, a strategic turning point, a demonstration of American industrial and military power. But at its core, it was a human tragedy played out on an epic scale, a reminder that war's greatest cost is always measured in the lives of young men who deserved better than to die far from home over causes they barely understood. We called it a Turkey Shoot because the enemy had seemed so helpless, so easy to kill. But turkeys don't choose to fly into the guns. The Japanese pilots who died that day made a conscious decision to press home their attacks against hopeless odds, knowing they would probably not survive. That took a special kind of courage, even if it was ultimately futile. In the end, the Turkey Shoot was both a great victory and a great tragedy, a day when American naval aviation came of age and Japanese dreams of Pacific dominance died forever in the blue waters off the Marianas. It was a day that changed the course of World War II and shortened the conflict by months, if not years. And it was a day when a young pilot from Iowa learned that victory in war is always paid for in blood, even when that blood is mostly the enemy's. The Turkey Shoot taught me that there is no such thing as a clean war or a costless victory. There are only degrees of loss, and on June 19, 1944, the Japanese lost far more than we did. But we all lost something that day, our innocence, perhaps, or our faith in the romance of aerial combat. The Turkey Shoot was many things, but it was not romantic. It was efficient, effective, and utterly ruthless. It was, in short, a perfect example of how Americans fight wars, with overwhelming force, superior technology, and grim determination to win regardless of the cost. As the sun set on the Philippine Sea that evening, painting the flight deck gold and red, I realized that I had witnessed history in the making. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot would be remembered as one of the decisive battles of World War II, the day American naval aviation achieved absolute dominance over the Pacific. But I would always remember it as the day Billy Morrison died, and 400 Japanese pilots chose death over defeat, and the sky filled with burning aircraft like some terrible fireworks display celebrating the end of an era. That was June 19, 1944. That was the day we broke Japan's wings forever.